Welcome to Forgotten Space History. In this episode, we go back to the very beginning of human space exploration, back all the way to the dark days of World War II, when the V-2 rocket, the first man-made object to enter space, was first launched in Nazi Germany. You might be asking yourself, the V-2 isn't forgotten history. Why talk about this rocket? The answer is simple. For context purposes, it is necessary to cover the milestones along with the stepping stones. Many of us remember what the V-2 was used as during the war, a weapon of terror meant to strike fear into the hearts of Germany's foes. While it's debatable as to whether or not the V-2 was successful in its intended role, it would be a mistake to ignore the technical achievements present in the V-2's design. There is also an element of forgotten history in the V-2's past. For instance, several intact V-2s made their way to the US, Britain, and Soviet Union, and arguably formed the basis of many experiments in rocketry that helped lay the foundation upon which the rest of human spaceflight has evolved from. Let's dive into the V-2's history, starting with its development and use during the war. Then we will see its uses post-war, and finally, at the end, we will take note of the true costs of the V-2. The V-2 started life with the name A4 as part of the Nazi aggregate series of rockets. Its lead designer was Wernher von Braun, who would later help the United States put a man on the moon. After initial failures with the earlier A3 and a pause to work out issues with the engine, the A4 was first test launched on October 3, 1942. During that launch, the A4 prototype reached an altitude of 84.5 kilometers. At the time, Walter Dornberger, leader of the V-2 program, declared, "This third day of October, 1942, is the first of a new era in transportation, that of space travel." He was not wrong. Eventually, on June 20, 1944, the V-2 became the first man-made object to cross the Kármán line, or 100 kilometers, considered to be the edge of space. In this flight, it would reach an apogee of 174.6 kilometers, or 108.5 miles. After this point, and some years of further work to bring the rocket to readiness, on September 8, 1944, Germany began launching the A4 in anger at its enemies, now known as the V-2 as part of the Vengeance weapon series. 6,048 V-2s would be constructed in total, of which 3,225 would be launched by Germany. Most historians consider the V-2 essentially worthless as a weapon of war. In comparison, the rocket cost upwards of 40,000 Reichsmarks, or roughly the same cost as a German fighter plane, of which the German Luftwaffe was in short supply. It also consumed roughly one-third of Germany's alcohol production, which was made directly from potatoes at a time when food supplies were severely short. The V-2 was also notably inaccurate, limited to use against towns or cities. Testing indicated that the V-2 would hit within a 4.5 kilometer circle around its intended target. But in practice, V-2s could only be expected to fall within 18 kilometers of their target grid. This limited the V-2 to targeting cities at best. Ultimately, the V-2 did little to aid the German war effort. Freeman Dyson, of later theoretical and astrophysics fame, had this to say on the V-2's effectiveness. "Those of us who were seriously engaged in the war were very grateful to Wernher von Braun. We knew that each V-2 cost as much to produce as a high-performance fighter airplane. We knew that German forces on the fighting fronts were in desperate need of airplanes and that V-2 rockets were doing us no military damage. From our point of view, the V-2 program was almost as good as if Hitler had adopted a policy of unilateral disarmament. Due to a shortage of explosives, V-2s were sometimes flown with warheads filled with concrete, or occasionally filled with propaganda photos of German civilians killed in Allied bombing raids. The V-2 was successful solely in its psychological effect, unlike the V-1 buzz bomb, which gained its name from the distinct buzzing sound of its pulse jet engine. The V-2 impacted at faster than the speed of sound. This meant there was no indication of the impending attack, only the sound of the detonation as it impacted. As World War II came to a close, the United States launched Operation Paperclip to round up key Nazi scientists and other technical information. The Soviet Union also ran a similar program called Operation Usvakem. During both operations, several V-2s, their technical information, and scientists were brought to the United States and the Soviet Union, where they would help form the foundations for both superpower space programs. The United States would use the V-2 as the basis for a number of experiments in the upper atmosphere. These included V-2 launches that carried pressure sensors, gas detection equipment, and radiation detection gear to measure cosmic radiation. One notable U.S. V-2 launch, on October 24, 1946, took the very first photo of Earth from space. Eventually, the U.S. developed the PGM-11 Redstone, basing its design on the V-2, which we will cover in a future video. The USSR would go on to directly copy the V-2 as the R-1. This would eventually lead to the larger R-2, still based on the German design, the R-5, and eventually the R-7, which would later be used to launch the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into orbit. The design and implementation of the V-2 was without a doubt a massive leap forward for humanity. However, it would be a massive disservice to not talk about the true and terrible price paid for this progress. First, let us talk about the cost felt directly on the war front. It is estimated that 2,541 people died as a direct result of V-2 attacks. In addition, 5,923 people were injured. This pales in comparison to a second and far more deadly price. The production of the V-2 took place primarily at the Mittelwerk, German for Central Works. At the Mittelwerk, slave labor from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp was used to construct the V-2. An estimated 60,000 prisoners passed through the camp. Many died at the Mittelwerk complex working on the V-2 or during the evacuation of the camp. Causes of death ranged from poor conditions leading to poor health, mass executions by the guards, epidemics, bombings carried out by the Allies, and other horrors. In the end, it is estimated that more than 20,000 prisoners died at the Mittelwerk and the Dora camp. Werner von Braun, who was protected from war crimes prosecution by the United States government, claimed that while he was aware of the conditions at the Mittelwerk and the Mittelbau-Dora camp, he felt helpless to change the situation. It is worth noting that this attitude may have been a result of run-ins with the Gestapo and an arrest in which he was detained for 2 weeks without knowing the reason or what his fate would be. Some believed him to be a communist sympathizer, while others felt he had a defeatist attitude, and von Braun was certainly aware that his standing could be threatened by a poorly placed comment about prisoner well-being. Prisoners at the camp and Mittelwerk also claimed that they had personally seen von Braun at both facilities while atrocities and executions occurred. One even claimed von Braun had a prisoner flogged for possible sabotage. The sentiment was that von Braun seemed to be indifferent to the prisoners' well-being, sometimes taking part or standing by as prisoners were tortured and executed before him. Whatever the cause of von Braun's lack of action, the fact that he did not act to aid the prisoners cannot be overlooked, and his service after the war will always bear the stain of that inaction. Others were also culpable for the atrocities committed in the production of the V-2. While many of them escaped justice via various means, others were tried and convicted of war crimes related to their work on the V-2. There are no words to convey the true scope of the loss of life. Indeed, we will probably never know the final tally. All we can do is remember the lives lost, remember their suffering, and ensure the advancement of the human race never again comes at the expense of human life. Thank you for watching, and I hope you will return for future videos in this series.